began with a sound, not the kind that belongs in the wild, but something wet and deliberate, like the tearing of hide. The night was blacker than coal, the moon smothered behind a curtain of storm clouds that hadn't moved in 3 days. Sheriff Alan Wicks swore he'd heard coyotes before, but what he heard that night was older, deeper, almost human. He wasn't supposed to be there. The ridge past Miller's Fork had been closed off for decades, fenced by rusted barbed wire and nailed with government signs half-eaten by moss. But curiosity, that quiet, fatal thing, had pulled him in. The reports were too strange to ignore. Livestock vanishing without a trace, campsites shredded, once a whole family that went up the trail in a camper and never came back down. He remembered the words of the last survivor who made it out alive, a woman named Elsie. She'd been found 3 towns over, barefoot and caked in blood that wasn't hers. When they pulled her into the hospital, she just kept saying the same thing over and over again. They're still down there. They never stopped eating. At first, it sounded like backwoods hysteria, until Alan saw the hollow. It wasn't marked on any map, a basin swallowed by pine and fog, the ground sinking into itself like a scar on the earth. There were remnants of an old settlement, log structures blackened with rot, a collapsed church bell, bones threaded through vines, and in the center, a well, not a water well, but something else. Wide, too wide. He peered over the edge, shining his flashlight into the dark throat of the pit. The beam went down, down, and disappeared into nothing. But for a second, maybe less, he thought he saw movement, like someone pulling back from the light. Alan didn't realize it then, but he had found the remains of what locals once called the Carter Kingdom, a hidden settlement built in the 1800s. Deep in the Appalachian wilderness. They weren't like the other mountain families. The Carters didn't trade, didn't marry outside, and didn't bury their dead. They ruled the hills with rituals older than the church, older than the country itself. And when the mines collapsed, when starvation came, they didn't die like everyone else. They changed. The first miner who stumbled across them in 1899 described it in his journal. Pages later found stuffed into a tin lunchbox, covered in dried blood. His words were half-smeared, but readable enough to chill the spine of anyone who saw them. They live beneath the hill, in chambers of bone. I heard them chanting, the air thick like rotted meat. They wear the faces of men, but move like beasts, and when the sun sets, the woods hum like the throat of hell. Alan had read that same entry, years before, when it was passed around the county office as a campfire story. But seeing the hollow now, the remains of that church, the black well, the faint marks on the trees, it didn't feel like a legend anymore. Then, the smell hit him. Sweet, metallic, familiar. He turned, sweeping his flashlight across the trees, and froze. There were crosses, hundreds of them, carved into the bark in a perfect circle. And hanging from one of them was a doll, a crude thing, made of twigs and human hair, its face painted with what looked like dried blood. Something shuffled behind him. He spun, the light cutting through the mist, catching the silhouette of something crouched near the ground. Its spine was bent, its limbs too long, like someone stretched a man until the bones began to splinter. The figure didn't run, it watched him, breathing. "Hello," Alan called out. His voice cracked, the figure tilted its head. Then another one appeared behind it. Then another dot. Alan took a step back, hand trembling toward his gun. But before he could draw it, the ground beneath him shifted soft, hollow, and then gave way completely. He fell, down into the darkness. When he woke, the air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and something burning. He tried to move, but his legs were pinned beneath something cold. Bone, dozens of them, arranged like the ribs of a great beast, and from somewhere in the dark came a whisper, soft, wet, and far too close. "Welcome home, brother." The light of his fallen flashlight flickered once, illuminating the walls around him. They weren't stone. They were covered in carvings, faces, hundreds of them, carved into the walls, their mouths open in silent screams. And in that moment, Alan Wicks realized the truth. The Carter Kingdom wasn't abandoned. It was waiting. Alan's scream didn't echo. The air down there swallowed sound, heavy and wet, like breathing through cloth. He pulled himself free from the pile of bones, each one smooth from age, slick with moisture. His flashlight lay cracked, but still burning weakly, the beams slicing through the pitch in narrow breaths of light. He aimed it forward. Tunnels, dozens of them. They wound off in every direction, carved into the dirt and clay, supported by beams that looked too deliberate to be natural. And in each tunnel, movement, not fast, just enough to let him know he wasn't alone. He called out again, not out of courage, but out of desperation. "I'm a sheriff. I'm not here to hurt anyone." The words barely left his mouth before something answered. Not words. A laugh, soft, childlike. He lifted the light toward the sound, and froze. A figure stood a few yards away, small, hunched, pale as candle wax. It had hair, thin and white like corn silk, and its face, God, its face looked melted. The eyes were bright though, wide and glassy, and when the beam hit them, they reflected back. Red dot. Alan stumbled backward, but his foot caught something. He looked down, hands, dozens of them, skeletal and reaching up from the dirt like roots. Every bone in his body screamed at him to run, but where? Every direction led deeper. He took a breath and began to move, keeping his light trained forward. The air got thicker. The smell of decay mixed with smoke, and somewhere distant, he heard what sounded like humming, a slow rhythmic tune. As he crept along the tunnel, he saw marks in the dirt walls, symbols burned into the clay, circles, crosses, strange patterns that repeated every few feet. The deeper he went, the warmer the air became, until it felt like he was walking into the mouth of a furnace. Then he saw light ahead, real light, flickering orange. He followed it, careful not to make a sound, until he reached the opening of a wide chamber, and what he saw made his mind recoil. There were people, dozens of them, all deformed, twisted, moving with jerks and spasms, their bodies bent from generations of something unnatural. Some wore animal hides, others scraps of old clothing blackened with soot. They were silent, all facing one direction, toward a pit in the center of the room. Alan crouched behind a pillar of rock and watched. The pit glowed faintly. Something was burning inside, bones, fat, hair. The smoke rose in a lazy spiral, toward a hole in the ceiling, and above it stood a tall figure. Draped in what looked like stitched human skin, the figure spoke, and though Alan couldn't understand the words, his stomach turned at the sound, guttural, rhythmic, like a prayer spoken backward. The others echoed the chant, their voices trembling. "Ra?" Then the tall one raised a hand, and from the shadows behind him, two more figures emerged, dragging something between them. It was a man, alive, gagged, bound at the wrists. He thrashed weakly, eyes wild. The tall one reached out and brushed a finger across the captive's cheek, almost tenderly, before drawing a crude blade from his side, a blade made of bone. Alan wanted to move, to stop it, to scream, but his body refused. All he could do was watch as the chanting grew louder, the fire brightened, and the blade came down, once, twice. The sound that followed wasn't human. Alan covered his mouth, the bile rising in his throat. The others surged forward, clawing for pieces of what remained, their hands slick with blood. The tall one didn't join them. He simply turned his head and looked directly toward Alan's hiding place. Alan's breath caught. He hadn't moved. He hadn't made a sound, but somehow, the thing knew. The figure smiled, or at least, its face stretched into something that resembled one. Then, in a voice that was both near and impossibly distant, it spoke. You shouldn't have come here, lawman. The kingdom remembers its trespassers. The torchlight flickered, and in that moment, Alan realized that the figure wasn't wearing stitched skin. It was stitched. Every piece of its face, every patch of its arms, had come from someone else. The light went out. Alan ran. He didn't know which tunnel he took. He just ran until his lungs tore and his legs felt like fire. Behind him, the laughter echoed, bouncing off the walls in 100 warped voices. He turned a corner and slammed into something hanging from the ceiling. It was a bell, small, rusted, hanging from a bone hook. When it rang, the sound was soft, but it traveled. He froze as the tunnels went silent. Then, from every direction, came the sound of feet, crawling, hundreds of them. Alan found another passage and dove inside, crawling through mud and filth, the air thinning by the second. Something brushed his leg, then his arm. Then something grabbed him. He kicked, twisted, ripped free, and burst through a thin wall of rotted wood, and suddenly he was outside again, gasping in the rain. The hollow stretched before him, silent except for the storm. He turned back. The hole he'd crawled out of was gone, just roots and rock. No entrance. Alan stumbled down the slope, half mad, drenched, his flashlight flickering weakly in his shaking hand. When he reached the tree line, he saw the first light of dawn cutting through the mist. He made it to his truck by some miracle, slamming the door, shaking as the engine sputtered to life. He looked at his reflection in the rearview mirror, and froze again. There was something carved into his cheek, 3 small crosses, perfectly straight, fresh. He hadn't felt it. The engine roared, tires tearing through the mud as he sped away, heart hammering. He didn't look back, but as he drove, the radio, dead for hours, crackled to life. A voice came through, distorted, whispering his name. Alan, the kingdom is never done. Static. Then laughter. The last thing he saw before he lost signal completely was a shape in the trees, watching from the ridge, tall, pale, and smiling. Alan didn't sleep for 3 days. He tried to tell himself it was shock, exhaustion, hallucination, anything but what it truly was. But when he woke up that 4th morning and found dried mud in his sheets, the same red clay he'd crawled through underground, he knew the kingdom hadn't stayed behind. He'd been marked. He drove to the sheriff's station at dawn, pale, trembling, clutching a flask of whiskey like it might keep him anchored. The dispatcher, Luann, looked up from her desk and froze when she saw him. Jesus, Alan, what happened to your face? He didn't answer. He just muttered, "Get the others. We're going back to Carter Hollow." They told him no. Every single deputy refused. They said he looked sick, said he was mumbling in his sleep, said there was no record of any Carter family. No old records, no deeds, no missing persons reports, nothing. It was as if the entire place had been erased from county files. So, Alan did what desperate men do. He went to the one person who didn't ask questions, Eli, a local trapper who'd lived in those woods for decades. Eli listened in silence as Alan told him everything. When he finished, Eli just nodded slowly and said, "You saw M? You really saw M?" Alan frowned. "You know them." Eli's eyes were hollow. "Know of them. My granddaddy warned me when I was a boy. Said never to hunt west of Stone Ridge. Said that's where the ones who stayed behind live." "The ones who what?" Eli lit a cigarette, hands shaking. "When the mines closed back in the 1800s, some folks didn't leave. They sealed themselves off. Started changing. Started worshipping something that wasn't human, something older than the mountains. They called it the king beneath the clay." Alan laughed, but there was no humor. "You expect me to believe that?" Eli blew out smoke. "You already do? You got the mark to prove it." Alan touched his cheek unconsciously, tracing the 3 small crosses. They burned under his fingers like hot wire. Eli agreed to take him back. "We go before dark. If we ain't out by sundown, we don't come out. The hike back to the hollow was silent. No birds, no wind, just the soft crunch of boots on wet leaves. The deeper they went, the more the air seemed to thicken, as if the forest itself didn't want them there. By noon, they reached the clearing, the same one from Alan's nightmare. But the entrance he'd crawled out of was gone. Only smooth rock. No sign of a hole, no sign of life, until Eli pointed. There, a wooden door, half buried in earth, disguised beneath moss and roots. Alan's stomach dropped. It hadn't been there before. They pried it open. The smell hit first, a dense wave of rot, smoke, and something sweet. Alan gagged. Eli just muttered a prayer and flicked on his lantern. Inside, the tunnel walls glistened like something alive. The deeper they walked, the more the air vibrated, a faint hum that pulsed through their bones. Symbols covered every inch of the walls now, carved deeper, painted in something darker than soot. They reached the main chamber, and Alan froze. The pit was gone. No fire, no bodies. Just silence and bones stacked neatly in rings around a single stone altar. Upon it lay something wrapped in rags, human-shaped but far too long, too thin. Eli whispered, "We need to leave. Now." Alan stepped closer, unable to stop himself. The rags twitched. Then a breath escaped from underneath, wet, rattling, alive. Eli grabbed Alan's arm. I said, "Go." But before they could move, the tunnel behind them closed, the sound of rock grinding against rock, sealing them in. The lantern flickered. A voice, deep and ancient, filled the chamber. It didn't echo. It just was. "You came back, marked man. The kingdom always reclaims its own." The rags slid from the altar. The figure beneath unfolded, a skeletal shape with skin like clay, eyes that glowed from deep inside its skull. Every joint cracked as it straightened, towering over them. The smell of earth and blood thickened until Alan could taste it. Eli fired his shotgun. The blast lit the chamber like lightning, and when the smoke cleared, the figure was gone. But behind them, from the walls, dozens of pale hands pushed through the clay. Faces followed, twisted, eyeless, grinning with mouths too wide. They weren't attacking. They were reaching, grasping, worshipping. Alan screamed as one grabbed his leg and pulled. Eli hacked at the arms with his knife, yelling prayers between curses, but there were too many. The ground beneath Alan gave way again, and he fell, this time into a deeper pit. He hit something soft. Then the lantern tumbled in after him and lit the space, a chamber filled with bodies. Hundreds, maybe thousands, all perfectly preserved, like the clay itself had mummified them. And in the center, a massive statue of a crowned figure carved into the earth, its mouth open wide. Alan realized too late that it wasn't a statue. The lips moved, the earth shifted, and a voice filled his skull. "Feed the king. Become the soil," he screamed, clawing at the mud, but it was swallowing him, sucking him down inch by inch, his limbs locking in place. He looked up one last time and saw Eli above, reaching for him. Before the clay sealed over his face, silence. Days later, a rescue team found Eli wandering near the ridge, covered in mud, muttering nonsense. They never found Alan, but when they brought Eli in, they noticed something strange. Carved into his cheeks were 3 small crosses, fresh. He died that night in his cell. The next morning, the sheriff's office received a call. Static on the line, then a whisper. Alan Carter reporting. Investigation ongoing. The kingdom's awake. Asterisk, if you made it this far, you've seen what waits beneath the hills. The Carter Kingdom wasn't just a story, it was a warning, and maybe, just maybe, it's still growing somewhere under our feet. But if you think this was the end, you're wrong, because what's coming next makes the Carter clan look tame. There's another ridge, one even deeper in the mountains, where people say the ground still moves at night, and the trees whisper names that don't belong to anyone alive. You'll want to see that one. So before the lights go out, tell me in the comments, what do you think happened to Sheriff Alan Wicks? Was he taken? Or was he chosen? And if you were trapped down there with the Carter clan, would you try to escape or join them? Make sure you hit subscribe before the next story drops, because the hills are full of things that were never meant to be found, and I'm about to show you every last one of them.